Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. In a way, I'm glad I'm speaking to writers, students, people in the creative field, not the creative industry. Believe me, the only creative industry are comedians. I took some liberty with the title and changed it from creative non-fiction to creative fiction, because I am a fiction writer and I pondered long and hard about this title. And the theme, as I understand it, is about reclaiming the voices of those least heard in society. Again, I thought long and hard about who those unheard voices are. There are unheard voices in many communities. In local communities in South Africa, I, for example, lived in an area called Riverlee. You go back to Riverlee Extension there, you still find those voices who do not want to speak, and when they do speak, it is, let us just say euphemistically, rather vehemently, with their fists, their legs, and very often with petrol. The anger is there. But I think a phenomenon in Southern Africa, or perhaps Africa, and perhaps in Latin America, is the phenomenon of migration. Maybe it is because the modes of travel are so easy. You can now get around the world through many ways. You don't have to walk, for example, from Mexico to the United States anymore. You get on board an illegal bus and you cross the border. And I think those voices belong primarily to people trying to disappear, as it were, in order to survive. And survival, as you know, is the most deep-rooted and abiding of all human instincts. It overrides everything. So at the work that I did at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we had community dialogues, and I met a Somali man who had tried to change his accent so that it sounded like he come from Durban, and when we asked him why, he said, look, I have to live, I have to survive. I can't go back to where I come from, and I'm not surviving here. So who are they? They could be anyone, residents of large metropoles, citizens of democratic countries, but they are people who have been forced to migrate. Except for those who arrived in foreign countries as conquerors and colonists, migrants have found that an almost inevitable consequence of their odysseys has been marginalization. And you'll hear this word, I'm going to use it quite often. Don't think migrants leave home for the sake of it. People love home, they have roots. Migrants leave their native habitats mostly because they suffer from poverty, often accompanied by repression, and they seek these greener pastures elsewhere. And the other phenomenon that in my work around the world, even at the UN, is that the cities have become the new green. Whether it's Mexico City, New York City, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, that is the new green. This is the greener pasture that people are going to. But very often those migrants end up suffering even greater poverty and repression, social stigma and xenophobia. But here I want to pause a little and just say, I think it is too simplistic of us to simply blame that on the prejudices of local communities. Somebody in Atteridgeville, when we conducted these community conversations, said to us, and especially in Africa, the fact is that migration is characterized by the poor accommodating the poor. When migrants from all over the world go to places, they go to places where they can find easy accommodation without the residents taking very quick response. So, for example, a migrant from Zimbabwe who moves in here will find it easier to go and squat, as it were, in, say, Alexander rather than the Zoo Lake, because at the Zoo Lake, within 12 hours, they would be thrown out. There's an accord between the residents there and the Parkview police, because I live in the area. They would clear out the migrants, those squatters as they call them, every day. So they go to poor areas, and so we end up with the poor accommodating the poor. But I don't know if there's any sociologists here, and I'm going to leave it to the sociologists to work out the broader societal implications of all of this. I'm a creative writer, and we usually explore the problem from within. And we conjure up characters and situations that depict that alienation, the sinking into silence, that I can only characterize as a retreat from one's innate humanity. You know, for a poet, there's nothing more tragic than a human voice that is stilled. And all you see or hear is that echo of the silent heart and the mind, and it's going to manifest itself in something violent or negative sooner or later. But I want to explore this through the work of 3 African writers. And the literary fundis among you will forgive me for having chosen 2 voices that I think are in danger of being lost to the world, and one that is as yet unknown. I hope at the end, when I do quote from that book, you people will have heard of him. I would go back to him and say, see, people, your voice is being heard. But anyway, I want to start off with Ellen Payton, Cry the Beloved Country. When I first read Cry the Beloved Country, I come from the Black Consciousness movement, and my first reaction was, listen to this white man postulating about black people being alienated. But as I grew up and my consciousness broadened, I recognized just what that novel was saying. Think about it. It is a story of 2 families, one black, one white, and they come from the same area in what we now call KwaZulu-Natal. They were neighbors, in other words. The patriarchs, this is the priest on the black side and the farmer on the other side, they shared one affinity. It was an abhorrence for the growing racism that was emerging just after the war, and what was happening to black communities particularly. And then suddenly these neighbors are torn apart when Absalom, the son of the black man, murders the son of the white neighbor. This deed takes place far away from their native Natal. It takes place in distant Johannesburg, this greener pasture. And Absalom is eventually executed. So those 2 families both lose their sons through violently. Now, Payton published that novel in 1948, the year the Nationalist Party came to power. And that novel, for me, prophetically lays out what was to follow the decades thereafter, particularly to rural communities. And I characterize them by a few words: migration, marginalization, alienation, desperation. If you think about the days when, if you were, say, a migrant worker, as they used to call workers, say, from Limpopo, if you didn't have a dom pass with you, you were a criminal. You lived in hiding. When you saw a van stop to try to hide somewhere, you couldn't find a job. And it actually criminalized an entire generation of human beings. So what has changed, though? How many Absalom Kumalos have over the years been torn away from their communities, were driven to acts of desperation, they were executed in apartheid, or are jailed today? And I've often asked myself, how many Absaloms continue to work in the mines? They toil away in the darkness, and when they ascend, it's only to perish in places like Marikana. So, has that much changed in the migratory patterns and the way people are treated? The second writer who struck me as capturing this kind of alienation is a Zimbabwean writer, the late Dambudzo Marachera. Now, if not many of you have heard of him, I wouldn't be surprised, because Dambudzo was one of those phenomena. Jackie, when I told her about it, she was very pleased because she actually read his work. Let me give you a little brief history of this strange human being. He was born in 1952 in Den, Rhodesia. He grew up in circumstances that led him to say, and I quote what he said about what his view of life was. It is, his view of life is a cockroach view of the world as seen from bedding down on other people's floors. Now, if ever you capture what it means to be an illegal migrant or a hidden human being. That for me captured it. Now, he grew up experiencing poverty, racism, violent repression that characterized Rhodesia in those days. But he wasn't passive. He didn't sit back. He educated himself. He was an activist. And of course, like activists do, even Nelson Mandela, they get themselves expelled from he was expelled from the University of Rhodesia then. He fled to the UK, studied at a college in Oxford, not Oxford University, but at a college there. And there too, in what was then seen as the nirvana of democracy, the nation that had defeated the Nazis and democracy was flourishing, he experienced the discrimination and marginalization that immigrants suffered then and are beginning to suffer in the UK now again. And I'm not blaming the British people. It is just that the British government, I think, is faced with this phenomenon of human beings moving into their country. Anyway, Dambudzo wrote his landmark book in the UK, Black Sun. I would recommend that you read it. It's a collection of stories, but it traces the lives of uprooted people desperately looking for ways of being more than just cockroaches on people's floors. And I can quote endlessly from there. I can keep you here all day talking about Dambudzo's work, but I would encourage you to read that book. He returned to liberated Zimbabwe, and yet he remained an alien. So yeah, he's the homeboy going home, and he remains an alien. And you ask yourself why. First of all, his radical views, and there was this ambiguous sexual orientation. Many people said he was homophobic, other people said he was bisexual. No one really knows, but for some reason his views on this and his views about the political situation in the emerging Zimbabwe alienated him. His own family abandoned him. His brothers said he was cursed because he had been fed some kind of bad muti as a child. It was his brother's way of absolving the family from the responsibility of being associated with a person like him. And the Zimbabwean government regarded him as a retrograde. In fact, he would have been driven into exile again if he didn't die at the age of 35. Now, there are stories that he was one of the first victims of HIV. No one can verify that, but I think his work is far more important than his life. So let's ask ourselves, are we fiction writers capable of only portraying the marginalization of humanity? And do we find tragedy easier to exploit than hope and progress? Well, I know that we delve into the darker side of humanity, but I believe ultimately it is in search of hope and redemption. And that ability to rise above the primordial instinct to survive at whatever cost. And here again, I'm going to think of some writers that people don't seem to know as the norm in South Africa anymore. Albert Camus, The Outsider. There's a Frenchman living in Algeria who writes a book about a Frenchman who shoots an Algerian on a beach. Why did I find that such a great book, though? It is because of the way he described this outsider, this person who couldn't fit in. He couldn't even get on with the dog. He used to walk the dog and fight with the dog. He fought with French people. He fought with Algerians. Why couldn't that person fit in? And then there is Eikwe Armas, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. You know, if I was in the Department of Education, I would make that, in the civil service, I would make that compulsory reading for every civil servant. When they get their, the sticker or whatever they do to get into their office, you get a copy of Eikwe Armas novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. So a fiction writer can tell people, let's not make the same mistakes all over and over and over again. But I want to illustrate this point of writers looking for hope by quoting the work of one of our emerging South African writers. Siphiwe Mahala's When a Man Cries. This book is the story of Themba Limba, a civil servant who returns to his community from which he had been alienated because of his behavior. There are the usual allegations for a civil servant. accused of corruption and sexual abuse. He leaves his home, he wanders around. After many years, he returns to his community, and he and his estranged wife meet, and they hug each other. And this is the last scene in the book, in fact. He walks into the house, he and his ex-wife talk, and they hug each other. Her mother, Aunt Nana, walks in and mumbles something before disappearing again. And what she says, and then his own silent response, for me captures how we have to search for our suppressed voices, both inside ourselves and by reaching out to others. So I want to read this last paragraph from Sipu Mahala's book. Tuli starts weeping as her face is buried against my chest. Tuli is his estranged wife. I squeeze her closer to my body. Aunt Nana walks in and finds us locked in tight embrace. When a man cries, a woman has to cry too, I hear her mumble as she disappears back into her bedroom. We are still locked in each other's arms. No one says anything. Only tears roll down in torrents. Mine are not tears of sadness. They are tears of joy. They are the expression of the infinite longing for complete humanness. To be a man among men, to love and be loved, to be capable of feeling pain for myself and for others, to cry when hurt. That's what makes a man. Without tears, he is incomplete. In a sense, when I first read it, I thought to myself, is it a deliberate attempt at ambiguity? But the message I'm getting when you read the whole book is we often inure ourselves to that human suffering, to our own and to that of others. We silence our voices, and the only way that we can actually reach out to ourselves is also by reaching out to others. And I don't know if fiction writers, creative writers, and even journalists, without subverting your independence, can start doing that, exploring ways of talking about xenophobia in a way that actually makes it possible for the affected communities to talk to each other about what it means to be a quere. And maybe my last anecdote is about Ariel Dorfman, the writer, academic who lives in the US, very peculiar history, born in Argentina. He was driven out of Argentina because his father had to leave in a hurry because the dictator was after him. He went to Chile. He worked with Allende's government. When Allende was overthrown, he too had to flee again. And so he came to South Africa to address the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Nelson Mandela annual lecture. We took him to township in Cape Town, and he then sat there and declared himself a liquere. And he then had looked up the word and he explained what it meant to him. An American academic now working at Duke University who understood what it was coming to borders, understood what it was having to consider, should he attempt to legally cross from Mexico into the United States, or should he take the illegal route and then end up as a fugitive there? He chose the legal route and he got asylum in the end. But you know, so it's not a phenomenon new to South Africa, and that I think is something we South Africans need to learn. Our problems are not unique, and our solutions are not unique.